Y'all can do better than that. Come on. Good afternoon. Now, I didn't expect to hear everybody at home or at work that's doing this at lunch for the millions of Tennesseans that I'm sure are watching today for this exciting program. And we're just delighted to play a role in the 225 celebration. And today is particularly special for me because we have Miss Weiss here, and this is the month right now we are doing a lot of presentations around the state for our Ann Dallas Dudley Award, where we are encouraging students across the state to get registered to vote and be engaged voters. It gives us the opportunity to tell the story of Ann Dallas Dudley and encourage these young people to grab hold of the power of the ballot box, which was at the very much the conversation that you're going to hear about today. It's also very empowering as we have the opportunity to visit other parts of the state. As we know during this movement that there were a group of Tennesseans and a group of people across the country who were left out. And we also get to tell that story as well, and to help a lot of young Tennesseans understand that not everybody has always had the right to vote and how that should be treasured, and not just go get a registration card, but actually be an engaged voter in the process. And what a wonderful treat we have here today with an accomplished journalist, accomplished author, Ms. Weiss, who I know is going to get a much better introduction than what I'm here at the last minute. I thought I was going to be out of town. I know Ms. Awad, our Assistant State Archivist, is going to do her right and give a wonderful introduction of her and what she's going to present to us today. But Ms. Weiss, you honor us with your presence. And I'm just delighted that you're going to take some of the things that you have learned and be able to share them with a lot of Tennesseans who know some of what you're going to talk about, but don't know a lot of what you're going to talk about. And so we can always learn more, and especially in this day and age, to be able to learn more about the rights and privileges of being able to go and vote and why it's important and how so many people fought so hard to make that happen. I'm grateful for your presence today, and we're honored that we can host this here at the Tennessee State Library and Archives. Without further ado, our Assistant State Archivist, Jamie Awad. Jamie?
Thank you so much, Secretary Hargett, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the Tennessee State Library and Archives. We are thrilled to have you here with us today. This is the final event in our four-part series of TN 225, where we've been looking at some of the stories of significant events that have taken place over the course of our history that have shaped the development of our state. So today's program is going to focus on Tennessee and the fight to win women's right to vote. Specifically, Tennessee's role as the 36th perfect state in needed to ratify the 19th Amendment. We are honored to have author Elaine Weiss with us here today to discuss, among other things, how she used the collections and the materials here at the Tennessee State Library and Archives to benefit her research and to write her highly acclaimed book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. So we've pulled several items at Ms. Weiss's, we asked her what her favorite things were or some materials that she found particularly useful. We have those up here at the front table, and Patsy Mitchell, an archivist here at the Library and Archives, will show you those materials. You're welcome to come up after the program, take a look, and see some of these original items. I'd also like to direct you all to the exhibit out in the hallway outside of these rooms. This was a collaborative effort among several of us here at the Library and Archives and our friends at the Tennessee State Museum. I see several of our partners here. We worked together as part of the TN Woman 100 Centennial Suffrage Celebration in 2020, and we were able to produce these exhibits and send them out to over 300 repositories across the state to teach individuals in their communities a little bit about Tennessee's role in the suffrage movement. So finally, after the program, we invite you, if you are interested, to do a behind-the-scenes tour of this great facility that we have here. We will be meeting in the lobby at 1:15. So now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest, Elaine Weiss. Ms. Weiss is a Baltimore-based journalist and author. Her work has been published in Smithsonian Magazine and the New York Times. She was the Goodreads Reader Choice Award winner. shortlisted for the 2019 Chautauqua Prize and received the American Bar Association's 2019 Silver Gavel Award. She holds a graduate degree from the Medill School of Journalism, that's my Southern coming out, I'm afraid, of Northwestern University, and has been recognized by the Society of Professional Journalists. She's a frequent public speaker and commentator, and we are thrilled to have her also as a researcher here at the Library and Archives. So please help me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Secretary Haggard. And thank you all for coming. And I see a lot of friends here, a lot of people at TSLA who have helped me over the years when I call with odd requests. And they're always wonderful and knowledgeable and helpful. And so I can't thank you enough. I'm so delighted to be here with you to help celebrate Tennessee's 225th anniversary, and especially to do this here at the Tennessee Library and Archives, where I have spent many, many happy hours doing research for this book and actually for my next book. And it holds the treasure of Tennessee's history, the nitty-gritty of how Tennesseans have lived and prospered and governed themselves. And today, my contribution to this very distinguished speakers series is to explore with you Tennessee's role in one of the greatest political battles in American history. And it took place right here in Nashville, when this city was the scene of the final battle of the long fight for women's right to vote. The War of the Roses, as it was called, for ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Took place right here in summer 1920. Of course, we were all primed to celebrate that in 2020. We got delayed a bit by a pandemic. Remember, the suffragists were also delayed by having to endure a pandemic, the influenza pandemic, just at the crest of their campaign to win the vote. So it was unfortunately almost appropriate that we had some delay because of the pandemic. Tennessee rightfully and proudly claims its place in history as the perfect 36th state. I'm gonna take this here. This was one of the first things I saw when I came to Tennessee for the first time in 2013 to begin research for my book. And I was sort of startled. Well, wow, it was here already. And it was very exciting to see this. I believe it's behind the Hermitage Hotel. I'm not gonna, I know the name of the street has changed. Now, the fight for the amendment, the fight for women's suffrage here wasn't easy. It wasn't pretty, but it is fascinating and instructive, and it is your history and your legacy. And my book, The Woman's Hour, tries to tell the story of this epic confrontation here in Nashville in all its drama and in all its triumph, but also in its complexity and even its ugliness. And it would be dishonest to do it any other way. So it's very appropriate that I get to bring that story home to you today. It's the story of how American women's demand for the most sacred right of a democracy, the vote, which was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, was slowly and methodically and at great cost transformed into constitutional law. It's the story of the 19th Amendment, the largest extension of the franchise in our national history, giving the vote to half of the citizens of the nation who were not included when the founding fathers constructed our government supposedly by and for the people. No, women were not mentioned in the Constitution, which we've been reminded of recently. Women citizens and their rights were purposefully left out. So fundamentally, this is a story of how change can be made in a democracy and in the Constitution and in society. Because the 19th Amendment was not just a legal change. It was not just a constitutional change. It was not just an election law change. It didn't just double the national electorate. It didn't just make women full citizens for the first time. It marked a societal change, a cultural shift in the role and the rights of women in America. And that change and that struggle is ongoing, as we know. In the summer of 1920, I get my centuries mixed up sometime, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And if the Tennessee legislature would ratify, women's suffrage would become the law of the land. If the amendment failed in Tennessee that summer, it could be delayed indefinitely and perhaps not be ratified at all. The enfranchisement of half of the citizens of the nation was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. Now, I came to Nashville and to the Tennessee archives to research this story for my book. And I'm going to illustrate this talk with some of the gems that I found here at TSLA. I came in the summer of 2013, and I purposefully came in summer. I wanted to feel the heat. Now, I live in Baltimore, it gets hot and humid, but everyone in the historical record really talks about the heat. That was a particularly warm, hot summer. And I wanted to understand what they were feeling. And remember, there's no air conditioning, and there's a couple of fans, but and the women are dressed in pounds of clothes down to the floor and to their wrists and their ankles, and they're wearing big hats. And I wanted to see what that was like to be in Tennessee in that hot summer. I stayed at the Scarlett Bennett Center because it was inexpensive. I stayed in a little dorm room with a shared bath. It was lovely. I took the bus to the old TSLA facility on Capitol Hill. And I just spent hours and hours. As you remember, it was not quite as lovely a facility as this, a little cramped, a little dark, but it held the treasures I needed. I spent hours walking in the footsteps of the suffragists. I spent time in the Hermitage Hotel, which was considered the third house of the legislature because everybody was staying there, and a lot of the action takes place in the Hermitage Hotel. I went to Union Station to see the magnificent, slightly salacious Tennessee Angels of Commerce, and to know that the suffragists and the legislators and the anti-suffragists who were arriving in Nashville for that fight passed through that Union Station. And it's been preserved, and I could describe what they saw. I went to the State House and took the tour and then walked around for hours and tried to see what would the view be from the gallery. What did the suffragists see? And these are my just research photographs that I took during that trip. And just to show how obsessive I was, I took a picture of the staircase up to the gallery. They're kind of narrow. I can't tell you how many steps there were, it was 18 or 23. I counted them because I wanted to see what the women who were running up and down, reporting on what was happening in those 10 pounds of clothes and petticoats and long dresses in the 95-degree heat, what they were experiencing. And I spent days at the old TSLA, and there I discovered incredible riches. The papers of the Tennessee suffragists, including Abby Milton, anti-suffrage leader Josephine Pearson, whose 11 microfilm reels are in your possession, and they give an amazing story of a late 19th, early 20th century Tennessee woman. The papers of Governor Albert Roberts are here, and the legislative record is here. All of those were invaluable to me. And of course, the incomparable Carrie Chapman Catt collection, which was like a treasure map, something that I could follow to write my story. Letters, memoranda, private notes, news clippings, little marginalia, little phone numbers written down. And all of that gave me a sense of what was happening here. I'm not quite sure how that collection was left here after the battle, but I'm very grateful to Carrie Catt for leaving it behind in her rush to go north, and also for the Guardians here at TSLA for preserving them for a century. By the summer of this is the view from the third floor of the Hermitage Hotel of the State House. This is approximately where Carrie Catt's room would have been. This is what she would have seen morning, noon, and night when she looked out with worry about the fate of the 19th Amendment. To be able to see that, to understand what she saw, was very moving to me. By the summer of 1920, when the 19th Amendment reached Tennessee, and here you see a cartoon that is in the TSLA collection. Again, this was supposedly Mrs. America wearing a corset in the shape of the nation, and she's saying, it's that last button, Samuel, it's that 36th button. And by this time, advocates for women's right to vote had been fighting for this right for more than 7 decades. Since that first outrageous demand for the right to vote was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights meeting in 1848. Now, of course, it had been talked about for long before, but this was the first official meeting that made a demand for the vote. Now, the idea of women's rights in this time, in mid-19th century, was almost almost an oxymoron, because women had very few legal rights in mid-19th century America. It's worth remembering that besides being denied the ballot, American women also did not have the right to sign a contract, could not sign a legal contract, could not bring civil suit, could not testify in a court of law. She could not be judged by a jury of her peers because she could not serve on a jury. If a woman was married, any property or wages belonged to her husband. She had no custodial rights over her children. If she left the marriage, she left the children. They too belonged to her husband. She could not be admitted to most colleges and universities or professional schools. Almost all professions were closed to her. By social rules, she was not supposed to speak in public, as I am doing right now. Doing what I'm doing before you, for men and women, was considered promiscuous behavior. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton tackled all of these prohibitions at the Seneca Falls meeting, and she actually demanded, one of her demands was equal pay for equal work. That was in 1848. And she wrote a resolution, resolution number 9, demanding that women have the right to choose their representatives and to have a voice in their government, to vote. Now, many of those attending the Seneca Falls meeting thought that asking for the vote was a terrible idea. It was too radical. It would make them the subject of ridicule. And they actually begged Elizabeth Stanton to withdraw the resolution and not put it before the conference. And there was a young man in the audience who had driven his buggy 50 miles from his home in Rochester to attend the meeting. And he stood up and he defended this resolution to vote. And he said, you must pass this. You must demand the vote. And he was Frederick Douglass, just 30 years old, just 10 years out of slavery, And he stood up and said, "You must demand this vote. It will never be given to women, as it will never be given to me as a Black man, unless we demand it." And he persuaded the very reluctant participants in the Seneca Falls Convention to actually accept this resolution and demand the right to vote. And Frederick Douglass, who is one of the great heroes of this story, called himself a woman's rights man for the rest of his life. And he truly, truly was. Now, Douglass didn't just happen to wander in. He was invited to the Seneca Falls Conference because he knew Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and other foremothers of the suffrage movement, because they began their political lives as advocates for abolition. And he worked with them in the abolition movement. And this connection between abolition and women's suffrage would emerge again in the Tennessee debate over the 19th Amendment and become an issue in the War of the Roses. In the years following that Seneca Falls meeting, there were many, many more meetings, and tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists in every state waged over 900 state, local, and national campaigns to win the ballot. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities across the nation. They had to change hearts and minds about women's role in society before they could hope to change laws. And that's something we have to really remember, that education process has to precede the political process or go hand in hand. Now, it was never easy to be a suffragist. They had to endure contempt and ridicule in their communities, in their churches, in their clubs, and even in their own families. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. They were attacked by mobs of angry men. In fact, Susan B. Anthony used to say she could mark the progress of the movement by the kinds of projectiles that were thrown at her. And when the eggs were no longer rotten eggs and just plain eggs, well, that was progress. They were again attacked by mobs of angry men and boys. They were denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, of course, even Bolsheviks. They were derided as unattractive, unsexed, hysterical. The men who supported them, and there were many Tennessee men who supported women's right to vote, were belittled as Mabels and Nancys. But those male friends of women's equality adopted a better name. They called themselves the suffragettes. I really love that. Clearly, women demanding equality and autonomy were frightening to some. And women's suffrage was a very divisive issue, nationally and here in Tennessee. In addition, the southern states were difficult places for the concept of women's voting on an equal basis as men to take hold. Southern mores and traditions, that pedestal where women supposedly were placed, was intended to keep women in her domestic sphere as a mother and a wife and little more, and out of the public conversation. Supposedly, Southern women's delicate nature would be sullied by touching politics, even just touching a ballot box. And an even stronger impediment was that here in Tennessee and in almost all the other Southern states, opposition to suffrage, and specifically to the federal 19th Amendment, was based on not wanting Black women to have the right to vote. Despite all this, Tennessee women did organize and did become suffragists, and they began organizing to gain the vote in 1880. And a suffrage club was established in Nashville in 1894, and a state league was formed in 1897. And Tennessee cultivated 3 generations of dedicated suffragists in all 3 grand divisions. here we go. This is, again, the situation where women are begging Colonel Tennessee, as he was called, the Tennessee legislator, for the vote. This is one of the clippings in the TSLA box of treasures, and you can find that. Again, here are Tennessee women marching for suffrage in their suffrage uniforms, white dresses with yellow sashes. And these wonderful suffrage activists across the state include Elizabeth Merriweather, Memphis suffrage pioneer, Lizzie Crozier French, founder of the Knoxville Equal Suffrage Society, and Tennessee State Association president. She listed her occupation as suffragist. Abby Crawford Milton of Chattanooga, who you'll find plays a role in the Woman's Hour. Two distinguished national suffragists were Tennesseans, but were no longer living in the state at this time. Ida B. Wells, who had lived in Memphis until she was hounded out for her work in documenting lynching in the state, and Mary Church Terrell, also from Memphis, who at that point was living in Washington, D.C. and was a great national leader. Locally, African-American women were organized for the vote by Juno Frankie Pierce, who I talk about extensively in the book, and Dr. Mattie Coleman. And they organized African-American women to work for suffrage and led them in using the vote. And they play a fascinating role in the story I tell. And then there's Nashville's own Ann Dallas Dudley, who is celebrated in that wonderful award. And here she made suffrage respectable for socially prominent women. And she served on the National American Women's Suffrage Board of Directors and became suffragists' best defense against claims that her colleagues were unattractive and bitter old maids, out to destroy the American home. The suffragists could reply with these photographs of Anne and her children and this scene of domestic maternal bliss. And Ann Dallas Dudley led Nashville's first suffrage parade in 1912, the first such demonstration in the South, and she again was often depicted with her children, proving that women could be good mothers and good suffragists at the same time. And that was important in the public relations battle that was waging. Tennessee suffragists became bold activists despite having to face such societal disapproval. And again, from their families, from their pastors, from lots of sources. Tens of thousands of Tennessee women became involved in the movement. They spoke at the State House, advocating for a constitutional change in the state constitution. They held public meetings. Here you see them in decorated car parade. They held open air rallies. They spoke on street corners and from the rumble seats of automobiles. They appointed legislative committees to lobby their state representatives, and they distributed literature at the state and county fairs, and even dropped suffrage brochures from airplanes. I love that. But resistance to this also remained strong. And both men and women formed anti-suffrage leagues here in Tennessee. And I have to explain that the suffrage movement operated on two levels. There was the state campaigns and the federal campaigns. And that's because in our federalist system, states control election laws and can decide who is eligible for the vote. And over the decades, the suffragists mounted campaigns in almost every state to change the voting eligibility laws, state by state, either by legislative action or by a referendum where only men could decide whether women could vote, because only men were voters. And there were some spectacular successes, especially in the western states. Wyoming was the first state to allow women to vote, first when it was just a territory and then when it became a state. Colorado was the first state in which women won the vote by referendum. Again, only men could vote, but they did decide that women could vote. But most state campaigns did not succeed. They were expensive, they were exhausting, and it was clear that in many states, including Tennessee, women's suffrage would never be granted by the legislature or by a referendum of men, and was actually never tried. There was never a referendum here. And so it was clear for the women of Tennessee and many other states that they needed a federal guarantee of women's right to vote. They had to go beyond the state decisions. They needed an amendment to the Constitution. That amendment was drafted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony and introduced into Congress in 1878. And it was stalled there for more than 40 years. It was voted down in either the Senate or the House or in committee 28 times. So meanwhile, the suffragists pursued a dual-track strategy of working to push the amendment through Congress, but also working in the states to push legislatures and to cultivate male support, which is what they had to do. It was men at every level who were making this decision, not women. The Tennessee suffragists tried to get what was called limited suffrage bill through the legislature in 1917. And this would grant women the right to vote in just presidential and municipal elections. They could not have a voice in choosing their governor or their congressmen or their senators or their state representatives, any position that really had power over their daily lives. And they mounted a strong campaign, both to the public and lobbying in the legislature. The anti and pro-suffrage women faced off at legislative hearings, and all of those are documented here in the House and Senate journals at the TSLA, and in the letters to the editors in the pages of all the Tennessee newspapers, and a lot of them are here in the TSLA. You get a flavor of what they were saying and what the arguments were. The anti-suffragists won that fight in 1917, and the suffrage measure died in the State House. Now, the slow pace of progress in Congress and in the states stirred frustration and anger among suffragists. They'd been working so long. A new generation of suffragists, the third generation, grew impatient. They were no longer willing to wait, to plead politely, to ask for their rights. They were willing to be confrontational and aggressive and rude and, if necessary, disruptive. A young woman named Alice Paul led a new suffrage group, the National Woman's Party. They picketed the White House, which had never been done before. They protested on the steps of the Capitol. They burned President Woodrow Wilson and his words in effigy, in bonfires on the streets around the White House. And some Tennessee suffragists, including Sue Shelton White of Jackson, who became down their noses till they bled. Finally, after this, in 1919, after World War I was over and women had participated in new and profoundly important ways, the federal amendment was passed by both houses of Congress and sent to the states for ratification. At this point, Tennessee politicians saw the winds shifting and feared that this federal amendment would force full suffrage for all Tennessee women upon the state, black and white. And they felt about this federal amendment much as they did about the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, that it was being forced upon them. So in the 1919 session, they tried to stave it off by granting women this limited suffrage. And they hoped that it would pacify women enough that they wouldn't demand that Tennessee ratify the 19th Amendment. So by the time ratification question and the amendment came to Tennessee in the summer of 1920, Tennessee women could vote for president and for mayor and for their city council. And Frankie Pierce and Dr. Maddie Coleman brought Black women to the polls in the municipal elections of 1919, and they had a strong voice in those elections. So again, by the summer of 1920, 35 states had ratified the amendment. 36, or 3/4 of the 48 states then in the Union, were required. One more needed. And through a strange series of happenings and maneuvers and court cases, it turned out that Tennessee would be thrust into the decisive role of possibly becoming the 36th state. Now, the suffragists knew that Tennessee was really a dangerous place to stage this definitive battle for women's suffrage. Nearly all the other southern states had already rejected the amendment, and they all used the same racist rationale of states' rights, and they did not want Black women to vote. They didn't make any bones about that. The amendment faced an uphill battle in Tennessee. Everyone understood that, but there was no choice. For the suffragists, Tennessee was their last best chance. And that's the story I tell, and I found it in the documents here at TSLA. The governor certainly did not want to have the battle for the 36th state take place in his administration. Governor Albert Roberts was facing a nasty primary fight in the summer primaries. He was already unpopular for his tax reform legislation, among other things. The last thing he needed was a divisive additional battle over women's right to vote. He did everything he could to both avoid it and then stall. The legislators did not want to come back to Nashville in the middle of the summer to have a special session to decide on the 19th Amendment and to be put on the spot before they had to face election in the fall. The national suffrage movement leaders didn't want to have to put the fate of the federal amendment to be decided in a southern state where everyone understood it was going to be more difficult. The only groups that actually relished this confrontation coming to Nashville were the Tennessee suffragists, who assured their national leaders that Tennessee could be convinced to ratify. And the other group was the Tennessee anti-suffragists, who relished a final bout with their female adversaries, and especially the enthusiastic president of the Tennessee Association of Women Opposed to Women's Suffrage, Josephine Pearson. And this is one of the most dramatic photos of the whole episode, and this is in TSLA, and this is the opening ceremonies for the Anti-Ratification Headquarters. This is their opening day. And so all the forces for and against women's suffrage gathered in Nashville. The campaign generals in their white gloves and their picture hats arrived. National leader Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the largest association of suffragists, came down from New York for 6 miserable weeks, trapped in the almost in house arrest at the Hermitage Hotel, because she couldn't be let out because she was so controversial that if anyone spotted her, that would actually hurt the suffragists. Young Sue Shelton White, who's a deputy for Alice Paul in the National Women's Party, the more radical wing, she is here to supervise the campaign on behalf of the Women's Party. So we have 2 suffrage organizations after the same goal, but not working together. Teaches us a lesson. And Josephine Pearson calls on all her anti-suffrage colleagues from all around the South and from the North. Hundreds of anti-suffragists come in on the train. She had promised her dying mother in Montego that this is Josephine, she would fight the scourge of women's suffrage if it ever arrived in Tennessee. And here it was. And she arrived from her home in Montego to defend her home state from what she called the feminist peril. And Ms. Pearson expanded her leadership to include the presidency of the Tennessee, the Southern Women's League for the rejection of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And this is, again, in the Josephine Pearson papers, and it's really wonderful to see how she expressed herself. We'll soon see an example of her handwriting. To be able to look at the real documents, to be able to see how they wrote, what they underlined, what they capitalized, all of this gives you a sense of their personality, of their frame of mind, what they're thinking and what they're doing. And so that primary source, that paper source, is really very valuable for anyone trying to tell the story. They were joined by more than 1,000 men and women from across the state and around the nation. And the Hermitage Hotel, again, became the center of action with everyone, including politicians and presidential representatives and corporate lobbyists all staying in the hotel. There were powerful forces working against ratification in Tennessee. Corporate, political, and ideological foes, each with their own reasons for opposing the 19th Amendment. Politicians who feared an unpredictable new voting bloc. 27 million women would be eligible to vote across the nation if the 19th Amendment was ratified, and no one knew how they were going to vote. So politicians here in Tennessee and across the nation wanted to keep the status quo because they feared what would happen. Clergymen, some supported the idea of women's right to vote. Many actually were against it and brought their opposition to the pulpit. Here in Nashville, there was a Sunday of anti-suffrage sermons because they felt that women's equality, the idea of women voting, went against the will of God, as they called it, because women should be subservient to men. That's what it says in the Bible. That's what Eve is supposedly made for, to be a helpmate of Adam, and there should be no questioning of her role. So they are very strongly supportive of the anti-suffrage arguments. And then there are corporations involved. And we don't often think of corporations being involved in the anti-suffrage movement, but they were. And it's really important to understand that. And it's important to understand which ones, why would corporations be against this? Well, the textile manufacturers here in the state, who were very powerful, again, cotton came in and it was made into cloth and made into clothing. The textile manufacturers actually shipped in, gave their women workers a day off and sent them to the legislature and pinned red roses on them to show that there were women who were against the legislature ratifying. They were afraid that if women had the vote, if mothers had the vote, they might want to abolish child labor. And their bottom line depended upon cheap child labor. And they didn't want anyone to mess with that. The liquor industry, which was very strong here in Nashville and in Tennessee, feared that women voters would insist on strict enforcement of prohibition. Now, prohibition was already in force in the summer of 1920, but they hoped that if they could keep women away from the ballot box, then maybe it wouldn't be enforced quite so stringently. So that was their reason for still, even after prohibition, pumping in money and resources for defeat of the 19th Amendment. And the liquor lobby sponsored a speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel that came to be known as the Jack Daniels Suite. And where legislators were plied with liquor morning, noon, and night, and encouraged in this hospitality suite to vote against ratification. And there were all these scenes of legislators being dead drunk and bouncing off the walls and having to be thrown in the showers before they can be sober enough to go in and vote. Now, all this also plays out during a presidential election. And here we're going to, again, see some of the documents that I was able to find that give a sense of what's going on here in Tennessee during those weeks. This was an anti-suffrage propaganda brochure, which one of my favorites. It shows a hen and a rooster, and the rooster the hen has walked off the nest, and she's wearing her suffrage sash, and the rooster calls after her and says, "Ma, the eggs are going to get cold." And she calls back, "Sit on them yourself, old man. My country calls me." And this is directed at legislators, and it says that a vote for federal suffrage is a vote for organized female nagging forever. That's a strong statement, which I'd like a bumper sticker of myself. Again, there are other documents. The threat of a Negro vote in Tennessee is brought up very blatantly. This is a letter from the governor to Carrie Chapman Catt, trying to kind of wiggle out of calling a special session, and he explains his reasons why. Here is a telegram from Sue Shelton White trying to pressure Governor Roberts to call that special session and bring the Tennessee legislators in to debate ratification. All of these are in this wonderful collection. And again, this is how the national press saw the situation. Tennessee legislature being wooed by pretty girls on both the suffrage and the anti-suffrage side. And businesses got involved too. As you can see, this was called War of the Roses. Why? Because pro-suffrage legislators were given yellow roses to wear to signify their allegiance to the suffrage cause. And anti-suffragists wore a red rose. So you could tell immediately where people stood. And of course, the great benefactor of this were the florists, because you had roses all over the place every day. And I found this wonderful ad, which from Joy's Florist, which was a popular Nashville florist. And how did I know they were involved? Well, I could see the receipts for the roses in the Tennessee archives. So, I mean, that was very exciting. And this is a really interesting ad that appears in the, I believe this is in the Tennessean, "Roses for suffragists' birthdays, lilies for aunties' funerals." There's a little pointed there, but I found that really fascinating. Again, here's the anti-suffragists getting pretty personal. Can anybody terrorize Tennessee manhood? Not if you defeat this Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which it was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in honor of one of the great founders of the movement. But it was also, that name was used in the South to remind legislators that Susan B. Anthony had also been an abolitionist. So all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and kidnappings and fistfights. The newspapers call it Suffrage Armageddon. The legislators flip sides. Suddenly, overnight, the entire Davidson County delegation deserted their pledges to support ratification and voted to reject it. The Speaker of the House switched sides, presumably under influence from the L&N Railroad, very powerful here in Nashville. The governor, under pressure from the White House, became a champion of ratification. All these switches take place within a few weeks, within a few days, really. The suffragists had to keep watch over the hallways, over Union Station, to try to prevent legislators from fleeing to avoid having to make a controversial vote. They actually had to keep watch. They sent delegations to all of those places, make sure nobody left Tennessee. And again, they were bombarded with this propaganda. And here is again, a letter handwritten by Josephine Pearson, and you get a sense of her florid personality. And all of this just helps solidify, you know what happens, but here you see the personal reactions to what's going on in real time. It's sort of like having a video of what was happening. Again, a letter from Carrie Chapman Catt to the legislators. There's all this correspondence going on. And again, there's all this pressure from the presidential candidates. Warren Harding is running for president with his running mate, Calvin Coolidge, against Governor James Cox of Ohio and his running mate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so the presidential candidates get involved in all of this. And I'm able, again, here are telegrams that are sent from, this is Harding trying to wiggle out of his latest flip-flop of whether he supports ratification or not. And again, we have this wonderful collage from the Tennessean giving an idea of scenes. Remember, there's no television at this point. There's not even any radio. Newspapers are the only way to get this news across. And here is a list of expenses. This is like the budget from the suffrage campaign. And this just gives you a sense of how this was waged. It doesn't just happen. It's an organized campaign. And here, again, the scene in the Senate, when the Senate does ratify, and the House Journal, which I was able to use, which has the debates and also the accounts of the votes. I have to say the outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment, and I won't spoil it for you. But after much maneuvering and heroic efforts by ratification advocates like Delegate Joe Hanover of Memphis, who kept the line in the House during this contentious vote, it does come down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the legislature. You may have heard of him, Representative Harry Byrne, who receives a letter from his mother. And that letter is actually not at TSLA. It is in the Knoxville Public Library, but you can see it, and you can even see it online now. And to see that letter, it's just sent to Harry Byrne, Nashville, and it gets to him within a day. So we learn a lot about what life was like by looking even at envelopes. But even then, even after that momentous vote, ratification was not secure in Tennessee. I learned that, and that was a surprise. The antis in the legislature, led by the Speaker of the House, and tried to deny that the vote was legitimate. There were parliamentary maneuvers, accusations of bribery, there was brazen perjury, there were indignation rallies, whipping up anger against Harry Byrne and other supporters of ratification. There was this Save the South rally at Ryman Hall, again, to try, these are all the distinguished anti-suffragists who are trying to get popular opinion to pressure the legislature to rescind the ratification, to change the outcome of the ratification. So deep was some Tennesseans' denial that ratification had been accomplished, that it was somehow stolen, that they rammed through a resolution in late August, early September, rescinding Tennessee's vote to ratify. Did you know that? That Tennessee actually tried to rescind its ratification. Now, it held no legal meaning. There are no do-overs in constitutional amendment ratification. But it was a desperate attempt to rally the anti-suffrage base, and indeed, Governor Roberts suffered defeat in the fall elections, in good part because of his support for the amendment. Today, Nashville is rightfully proud and celebrates its role in winning the vote for American women, and does it in such creative ways. Here's the gift. This was how the national media showed Tennessee giving the gift of women's votes to American women. We have the Suffrage Monument in Centennial Park, which I hope you've all visited. I was just so honored to be there when it was first dedicated, and it was a very special moment. And there have been wonderful exhibits here at the Tennessee Library, and something close to my heart, the Votes for Women room at the Nashville Public Library, which you really all must visit. It's quite spectacular. This story that I've just told you took place a century ago. But there are surprising and even unnerving modern themes in this story. It deals with topics that dominate our headlines right now: voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights and women's autonomy, inequality, dark money in politics, the role of religion in public policy, the politics of protest, and racism, because the history of suffrage in America and in Tennessee is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there are cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and as you can see, the Confederate flag becomes the symbol of the anti-suffrage movement. The story of women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment is both inspiring and a cautionary tale. It's complicated, it's messy, it's not simple. There are moral compromises made by both the suffragists and the anti-suffragists that should and do make us wince. And we must learn from the mistakes of the movement as well as its accomplishments. And like all aspects of our history, we must tell the story in all its complexity, including its failings. Owning up to the racism, the xenophobia, the misogyny revealed in the record, much of it here in this building, of those opposed to women's equality, but also those advocating for it. When an honest look at history makes us uncomfortable, we can and we should learn from it, emerging from that encounter wiser and stronger. Confronting history honestly allows us to understand not only our past, but helps us understand our present. It provides a lens for viewing our present circumstances and issues, and helps avoid repeating mistakes. The holdings here in this magnificent building gives you as Tennessee citizens and me as a chronicler of a moment in your history a great gift. The witness and the wisdom of the unvarnished, unedited, unmanipulated historical record. And this beautiful, beautiful building is a fitting home for such a treasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine, and I think we have a few moments for questions, if there are any. Oh, okay, and we have have a microphone David will bring to you.
Hello, David.
Thank you for your wonderful research in your book and speaking about this great Tennessee story across the country. Your book brought a lot of attention to this kind of forgotten story, and so did the 100th anniversary. As a researcher, now that all that has happened, have more documents come out that you have seen, or what did you make of we have some Tennessee documents here, but as you know, not many photographs of the marches and the actual time of the Capitol.
Right. I wish more had come. I don't know if any have sort of surfaced. I know you have helped me because you have some wonderful documents yourself. One of the most moving ones you showed me was the ballot box that I believe your grandmother used to vote. So I hope there are more and that there are efforts. I know that there are efforts to get people into their attics and try to find some documents or pictures or memorabilia or buttons that their ancestors may have had representing their participation or opposition to the movement. So I'm hoping that comes out. It certainly is happening around the country, and I think there has been. But mostly there's just more recognition and understanding of the role of African-American Tennesseans in this movement and across the nation, of the fact that, of course, we know that even the 19th Amendment would not bring full citizenship and voting rights to African-American women, just as the 15th did not bring it to men. There would be state laws, Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, which would prevent full participation until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 40 years later. For Native American women and Asian women, they also could not vote under the 19th Amendment because they were not considered citizens at the time. They would also wait decades longer. So I think we need, a greater understanding. But the documentary record, I wish there were, great photographs. There are some more photographs, of course, in the Library of Congress, because the National Women's Party were just brilliant at documenting everything they did.
Hello, Elaine. I'm Alma Sanford.
Oh,
I'm
Alma.
the founder of the nonprofit that built the Suffrage Monument here in Nashville. And I want all of you to know that I am today working on combining our materials to tell you the story of the 10-year effort to raise private money to build that monument. As all women's activities, we drew strong opposition to putting our monument on state property. Therefore, it's on city property in Nashville. I will make sure that story is told and those papers will be donated to this museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Alma, and thank you for all of your efforts.
Any other questions or comments? Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Debbie Gould with the League of Women Voters, and I wonder, so incredible to have such organization across the entire state that you document, even in these tiny towns everywhere. And I wonder, was there any sort of solidified effort after women got the right to vote to go behind specific legislation in an organized way, such as child labor laws?
Well, yes, there certainly was. And of course, the League of Women Voters is the daughter of the suffrage movement. The Tennessee State Suffrage Association becomes the League of Women Voters, and in every city and town, the League of Women the suffrage organizations transfer after ratification, become the League. And there was something called the Joint Congressional Organization in Congress to try to get social legislation passed, like trying to outlaw child labor and also some other maternal health kind of bills. They met opposition often by the same people who had opposed women's suffrage. So yes, there was organized. Whether they were organized, I believe they were also organized here in Tennessee, and Juno Frankie Pierce works with the white suffragists to make sure that her community gets some of its requests. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
again.
you. Thank you.
Again, we really, really appreciate it. I hope this inspires our audience as well to come and take a look a little bit in some of the collections here we have at the Library Archives. There are a host of Tennessee stories left to tell. I remind you of the exhibit out in the hallway. If you would like a tour, please go to the lobby, and I believe we will do tours at 1:15. And I invite you all back on June 1st and June 4th as we celebrate Statehood Day. We will have the original constitutions, we'll have programming for families, living history interpreters, so please come back and bring your family and friends. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. Good group. Yeah, it was a great group. Yeah. Suddenly it like.
I know.